Mr. Rubenstein is an expert on American foreign policy, religious conflict, terrorism, and methods of resolving serious international and domestic disputes. He has lectured throughout the U.S. and Europe on topics ranging from the philosophy and practice of conflict resolution to the war on terrorism and current conflicts in the Middle East, and he has appeared on numerous radio and TV shows and in film documentaries discussing these issues. He's a frequent speaker and the author of 8 books. Tonight, he'll be discussing with us his newest book, Reasons to Kill: Why Americans Choose War. The book is available for purchase in the Global Exchange store at the front of the restaurant, and there will be a book signing following this discussion. I'd also like to mention this event is live streaming at busboysandpoets.com, so please join me in giving a warm welcome for Richard Rubenstein.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here and see so many old friends, new friends, students, creditors. We're very happy to be here and to talk about a topic that's very important for us, for America, for the world, and that hasn't been really discussed very much before. The book is called Reasons to Kill: Why Americans Choose War. And the key word, I guess, in the title is Americans. Because this is not a book about why leaders go to war. It's not a book about why people who may have economic or political interests in, that lead them into international conflict and go to war. But rather, it's about why ordinary people follow them a lot of the time into war, including into some really stupid wars. Also, from time to time, this book is about why people don't follow the leader. In other words, what I'm mostly interested in is how ordinary folks, people like us, think about matters of war and peace, and how they are sometimes engaged by leaders bent on war into doing things that they later regret. Later regret, but I must say also often don't seem to learn from. And so I also want to explore the reasons for this kind of learning hiatus. The introduction of the book tells you something about why I decided to write it. I was in 2001, as I am now, a teacher at the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University, ICAR as it's called, which is the nation's oldest and largest, and as far as I'm concerned, best center of conflict studies, where we train hundreds of graduate students and also undergraduates to play a more constructive role in the world in terms of peacemaking. Something that they already want to do, or else they wouldn't have come to us to begin with. So it's a wonderful place to work. I've also written some books on terrorism and other subjects, so that when the great tragedy of September 11, 2001 took place, I got a call from NBC News to come down to the studio. This is the day after those ghastly events, to come down and talk about the meaning of the events. And I said, not really thinking it through properly maybe, I said sure, and I came down at 6:30 in the morning to Channel 4 in Washington, wondering if anybody would even be watching television at 6:30 in the morning. Got on with a couple of very nice interviewers, and one of the interviewers said something like, how could people have done such a ghastly, atrocious, irrational, cowardly act as the attack on the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and so forth on September 11th. And I took a deep breath and I said, number one, it certainly was a ghastly, horrific, inexcusable attack that killed thousands of innocent people for no good reason. But I said, you know, when you use words like cowardly and irrational and so forth, you're really distracting us from a very important question, which is, why it happened. And when we look at why it happened, then we have to say, this is not to excuse the act, but we have to say that the United States behavior in the world had something to do with why it happened. There are a lot of people out there who hate us. And they don't hate us just because they're crazy. They hate us because of things that we're doing, that are being done in our name. And like that. So, and I stopped. All of this took about 90 seconds. And the show was over. And I breathed a big sigh of relief and got in my car and went home thinking, why did I even come out here so early in the morning? And by the time I got home, the phone was jumping off the hook. First call was from NBC itself, or some person at the NBC studio said, "What did you say?" The switchboards lit up. We can't answer all the phone calls we're getting on the switchboard. The second call was from Alan Merton, the president of George Mason University, who said, "Rich, I'm calling just to tell you that I'm not going to fire you. And your job is okay, even though I've gotten 20 calls in the last 10 minutes asking for your head." I used to think the trouble was that I spoke too soon after that event. But now I think maybe, I don't know, because we still can't talk about it. It's still very, very difficult to talk about why we are generating so much hostility, why there's so much violence being pointed at us around the world, and what our own actions and thoughts might have to do with that. People still think if you talk in these terms that you're apologizing for the violence. When what people in my field in conflict analysis and resolution are trying to do is to understand it so that we can stop it. Well, all of this led me to ask myself, why is it that Americans get mobilized for war? Why is it in particular that after a long history in which we had some wars in the 19th century, the 20th century has become the time of permanent warfare. And especially since 1990, when we had the beginnings of the Persian Gulf War, we have not been out of a state of war since that time. What promotes consent, if there is consent for this kind of war? And if it isn't consent, because clearly people don't like it very much, we know that from recent polls, they're also tolerating it. What promotes toleration, if not consent, for this kind of permanent state of war? Well, I love history and I love storytelling, so my own bent took me back to look at American history and to ask the question, if we look at American history and look at the stories of the U.S. in war and in peace, what do we find out about the reasons for American support for so many wars, especially lately? First thing that happened when I started the inquiry is I ran into a number of people who thought they had the answer, many of whom were I could classify under one or another of two approaches to the American psyche, if you like. One is the idea that Americans are gullible fools. That basically we're stupid consumers who will buy anything if it's sold cleverly to us. And that includes wars. There's some, superficially at least, some convincing evidence that that's true. Because there are a series of wars that have been sold to the American people on the basis of lies. Starting with the Mexican War, which President Polk promoted on the basis that the Mexicans had attacked American troops on American soil, when in fact he had sent troops into disputed territory to provoke the attack, because he wanted to seize the West, which he ended up doing. Or the Spanish-American War, which was promoted largely on the basis that the Spanish just blew up the USS Maine in Havana Harbor when it was almost certainly an accident, etc., etc. Then all the way down to the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which was, of course, a complete phony cooked up by Lyndon Johnson to try to get congressional authorization to allow him to do whatever he wanted to do in Southeast Asia, which he got. Contrary to this theory of the kind of gullible fool, what I call in the book the innocent dupe theory. There's another theory that says, no, we don't go to war because we're duped. We go to war because we like it. We go to war because we're basically natural-born killers at heart. There's a warrior culture in the United States, comes from the frontier days. We're kind of all still in the cowboys and Indians mode. And so we're frontier killers, and that's why we agreed to go to war. The trouble with these explanations is that there's some truth to both of them. You can make a case. You can make a case for both. But they run into some serious contrary evidence. First of all, not only are they insulting to us, but you would think by reading these explanations that there was never an anti-war movement in the United States, or that there were no serious anti-war movement. When in fact, there has never been a war in the United States, with the exception of World War II, which did not generate a serious, a large, a substantial, passionate anti-war movement. Sometimes, in fact, amounting to a majority of the population, or almost a majority of the population. So if we were so easily duped into war, if we were so easily gotten to fight because we love to fight, why would there be this history of very, very serious anti-war movements, which I talk about in the book, and I'm not going to talk about here, it takes too long. Why, in other words, would there have to be a debate about getting into each war and continuing each war? And why, and what were the terms of that debate? Well, when you start to look at the discourse, at the discussion between Americans in the periods of run-up to war, beginning of the war of 1812, ending in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And the book covers, the whole gamut. One thing that strikes you very forcibly is that Americans are talking about whether these wars are necessary or not, and whether they're just. That is to say, they get into war because the basic appeal is to what some people have called the civic religion, a set of beliefs and values and also rituals and actions which have a relationship to organized religion but are something other than organized religion. The civil religion. And civil people appeal to us on the basis of the civil religion, and if the appeal is successful, we go to war, and if it's not, we don't. This insight, by the way, is not just mine. It's now shared by a number of social scientists who have been talking about the continuing importance of just war doctrine in American thinking about wars. That leads to the next question, which is, well, how does that work in practice? How do we get convinced to go to war on the basis that the war is just? And here, I think, let me tell you quickly some of the main arguments, the main reasons that are offered and that provide the basis for people to follow the leaders, at least sometimes, into war. Okay, one basis, and I'll come back and I'll say a word or two about a few of these categories. Self-defense. So-and-so has attacked us. We have a sacred right and a collective duty to defend ourselves. The most common and in some ways the most powerful argument for war. And in fact, I'll stop there and just say, comment briefly on that. The problem is, what does self-defense mean? Initially, early in the Republic, when de Tocqueville visited America and remarked in his great book, Democracy in America, these Americans are not very interested in war. They're much more interested in business and in their family lives and so forth. They're not very good warriors, even though the whole country's armed. At that time, self-defense meant an attack on United States territory or United States citizens on United States territory. That's the common sense meaning, I suppose, of self-defense. But then if you think about it, you realize there have only been about 4 attacks, there have only been about 4 instances of self-defense being raised in response to a direct attack on American territory. I mean, there was The British burning Washington in the War of 1812 and attacking New Orleans in the War of 1812. There was, if you want to conclude this, the Southerners attacking Fort Sumter in 1861. There was Pearl Harbor in 1941. And there was September 11th. That's it. So that's the only instances of self-defense in the classical sense, in the in the literal sense of the word. And what are we talking about when we talk about self-defense? When we talk, I explained in the book that we're talking about two things. One is the defense of American institutions and values against threatened attack. Not American people or territory, but American institutions and values, at least as interpreted by certain leaders. And the classic instance of this, as I talk about in the book, is Andrew Jackson making war on the Seminole Indians in Florida because the Seminoles were accepting runaway slaves in their community. Jackson said that self-defense justifies the war against the Seminoles because they're attacking the slave system. Right? Later on, there's a further transformation, even more abstract, if you like, even more empowering to people who want to make war, is the idea that self-defense means defending the last established imperial outpost against attack. It doesn't matter why we're there. I mean, we can invade Iraq. We can invade Iraq under the misapprehension that there are weapons of mass destruction there, etc. So we have no reason being there at all. But once we're there, if anybody attacks us in Iraq, self-defense justifies a violent response to that attack. At this point, self-defense becomes defense of the empire and washes away the distinction between defense and aggression, and washes away the distinction between the United States as a nation and the United States as an empire. Since there are problems with the self-defense rationale for war, one of the things that happens is the development of a second rationale, and that's the evil enemy rationale. And even though I must say I like this chapter very much, myself and I will be here all night if I go through it. Basically, what I have to say about evil enemies is let me summarize it very quickly in two ways. When self-defense raises questions, are we really under attack? Are we really endangered? Isn't there some other way to respond to this apparent danger than making war? A common response is, oh no, you've got to make war because that's an evil enemy out there. What does that mean, evil enemy? It means someone who is, theologically speaking, diabolical. That is to say, someone who wants your harm because that's his nature, like Satan's nature, to want to harm you. It's somebody who's malicious by nature. Somebody who stands, in effect, outside of history. Somebody about whom it's useless, it's silly to ask, why are they doing that? Why don't they like us? They don't like you because they're evil. It's their nature not to like. It's evil's nature not to like good. So this underlines the distinction between us who are good and they who are evil. And it also actually lends characteristics to the enemy that are eerily similar to the characteristics of the devil in classical literature about Satan. That is to say, the devil is, as I just said, malicious. The devil is tyrannical. The devil is very clever. The devil lies. He's the father of lies. Etc. So when we have an incident like Pearl Harbor, another great atrocity, to be sure, this time committed by the Empire of Japan, it's not considered just an atrocity committed by the Empire of Japan. The historical reasons that have to do, for example, with things like competition between the Japanese and American empires in the Pacific. It's considered to be a diabolical act perpetrated by an evil enemy who is sneaky and untrustworthy and who is the father of lies. this image of the enemy as actually literally diabolical carries you quite a long way in a religious society, in a society where people, in one way or the other, often think in a religious framework. It also relieves an administration that wants to go to war of the necessity to prove anything more than the evil character of the enemy. And finally, it leads us to portray ourselves as the opposite. That is to say, it strengthens our tendency to portray ourselves as wholly good, as opposed to the wholly evil enemy. And that leads me to the next item on the list of rationales for war, which is the moral crusade, the humanitarian intervention. Because what really underpins our willingness to go to war for moral reasons, to liberate the oppressed, is two things. One is a conviction which is perfectly justifiable, that the oppressed ought to be liberated. There is such a thing as oppression. We know something about it. We feel the duty to liberate the oppressed. In Cuba, where the Spanish were committing enormous atrocities against the Cuban independence fighters, clearing land, removing vast numbers of people and putting them in concentration camps. They were called reconcentration camps in Cuba. Using torture against insurgent leaders, independence leaders, to find out information. Doing the whole panoply of atrocities that we now identify with occupation of a country and conduct of a vicious counterinsurgency campaign. The Americans reading the Yellow Press, as it was then called, read all about what the Spanish were doing in Cuba and said, my God, we have to do something about that. And they did something about that. They liberated Cuba from Spain in 1898. But there was a problem. And the problem was they had portrayed themselves as liberators as opposed to the evil oppressors. They had suppressed the dark side, if you like, of America in order to picture themselves as liberators, not oppressors, not occupiers. And so the next round of that history takes place at the end of the Spanish-American War proper. In 1900, Emiliano Aguinaldo, the leader of the Philippine national movement, who had fought side by side with the Americans to get rid of the Spanish, turns to the Americans and says, now it's our turn to run our own country, right? And President McKinley in the White House has a profound experience, a spiritual experience. He couldn't sleep all night, finally had either a voice or something. Anyway, he had an insight. The insight was the Filipinos are not ready to govern themselves. Therefore, our Christian duty is to uplift them, to Christianize them, to civilize them, to make them capable of self-government by annexing the Philippines. McKinley evidently had some problem recognizing Catholics as Christians, but because he kept talking about Christianizing them. At any rate, the next stage you probably know, and I won't bore you with the history if you know, is a war of counterinsurgency that was, if anything, worse than what the Spanish had done to the Cubans, and used the exact same techniques. Clearing land, creating concentration camps, reconcentration camps, torturing insurgent leaders, putting people in a situation where it's inevitable they were to get diseases and die from the disease. The death toll from the U.S. war in the Philippines 1900 and 1902 is about somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000. Nobody knows for sure. Filipinos died in that struggle. And I'm not saying that just to talk about how brutal we are. I'm saying that to talk about how deceived we were to think that we could just act as liberators when in fact we had imperial ambitions of our own. That this dark side, if you like, would not emerge in the course of further struggle. It was wildly self-deceptive, and it's the kind of self-deception that continues all the way down to Iraq, all the way down to Afghanistan, all the way down to wherever we decide to fight next. Somalia, Yemen, wherever that may be. So, I have a chapter in the book which I wish I had time to talk about, and I think I don't tonight, about patriotism, about the way patriotic duty is used as a way, as a kind of make-weight, as a way of bringing people around to accept the necessity of war when they, in other ways, are doubting the official rationales for war. But I want to go on to, before I use up too much time, to talk about a final and I think decisive argument for war, which is very persuasive to lots of Americans, which has to do not just with its justice on the basis of morality or real enemies or self-defense or patriotic duty or national honor, but the necessity of war because there's nothing else we can do but fight. That is to say, war as a last resort. The idea that war should be a last resort is enshrined in just war doctrine from the Middle Ages on. And so I want to talk about, in two ways, about what it means, what it has meant to the United States. When people, from President Polk to President Obama, say we have no choice but to fight. War is a last resort. The first thing they often mean by that is the other side won't negotiate. Or, a variation on this, the other side might pretend to negotiate, but what they would actually be doing is screwing us, the way Hitler did at Munich. So you can't negotiate with them either because they refuse to negotiate or because they're not trustworthy enough to negotiate with. President Obama, by the way, says that about Al-Qaeda. Before when he got his prize, his Nobel Peace Prize, he said you can't negotiate with Al-Qaeda. And if I had been in the audience, I would have been tempted to jump up and say, have you tried? Why can't you negotiate with Al-Qaeda? Because they're so violent? Because they're so mean and awful and bigoted and all of that? They're all of those things. They're violent, mean, awful, bigoted. Who do you think you negotiate with in a war? If it isn't people who are trying to kill you and who are violent, mean, bigoted, and all the rest. This is not saying that negotiations with Al-Qaeda would be a good idea at this very minute, or that they would necessarily work. But the idea that Obama gets up before the Nobel Prize Committee and says you can't negotiate with them. He's the same person who says you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. Raises the question, well, if Al-Qaeda is not just the devil incarnate, if they actually have a platform, if they actually want something, do they want anything that we could talk to them about? I don't know. I don't know the answer to the question. I know that the experiment hasn't been made. And if it's true of Al-Qaeda, how much more true is it of the Taliban? So first of all, there's this thing of who do you negotiate with and what are the limits of negotiation? Who can't you negotiate with? Who do you know you can't negotiate with? And I would argue there's nobody that you know you can't negotiate with until you try. But second is the whole problem of negotiation. When we talk about war being a last resort in this country, we mean we try to negotiate in the spirit of classical negotiation. Classical negotiation means bargaining. It means you take your weapon and you don't lay them on the table, that would be impolite. You put them in your pocket or you put them under the chair. But everybody knows they're there, and then you negotiate from strength. So you try to reach a bargain which is in accordance with your power, at least as you conceive of your power. And so that kind of negotiation is always about what will you concede, what should we concede, what are your interests, what are our interests. Classical model of negotiation. If you want to hear more about that, get somebody to talk to you from Johns Hopkins School of International Studies. You can hear all about that. But if you're talking to me and people from the George Mason ICAR organization, then we will tell you that there's another way to negotiate. It really is not, let's not call it negotiation at all, let's call it conflict resolution. It means the parties come together, very often with a good facilitator, although that's not always necessary, and the parties are enabled to talk about what's really causing their conflict. What are the underlying issues that have got them at each other's throats? What's the system which embraces them all, which is broken down? Or which maybe doesn't exist at all and needs to be created? What are the underlying causes of the conflict? And what can be done about it? Not what will you concede, what will we concede, if you don't concede we'll hit you over the head. That's not conflict resolution. Conflict resolution is an analytical process. And it's an analytical process that leads people to an understanding of what's really going on. The way it led the parties in Northern Ireland under George Mitchell's facilitation to understand what's going on. The way it led parties all throughout the ex-Soviet empire states, all of those countries that were predicted to explode after the Soviet Union pulled out. Everybody said Bosnia is only the beginning, now it's going to be Macedonia, and now it's going to be this, now it's going to be Moldova, now it's going to be Latvia. None of that happened. And one of the reasons it didn't happen was because the place was lousy with conflict resolvers. And conflict resolvers went to work in those countries, people like Hal Saunders in the United States, people like Joe Montville, your neighbor in Washington, and any number of people I could name, including some of my own colleagues, to deal with these conflicts in a way that would turn the attention of the parties to what the underlying issues were and causes were, and help them to do something about changing the conditions that produce violence, not just bargaining, not just making concessions. So one of the things I'm here to tell you, to assert, that I believe very strongly, is that if conflict resolution hasn't been tried, never mind negotiation, if conflict resolution hasn't been tried, war is never a last resort. If you don't try to bring in neutral, trusted facilitators into Afghanistan, people who can get the Pashtuns together with the Uzbeks and etc., and all the other groups in Afghanistan that are at each other's throats, whose conflict is being exacerbated by United States intervention, if you can't withdraw it to the extent necessary to let people try to make their own decisions in a country like Afghanistan with the help of expert conflict resolve, war is not a last resort. It is not a just war, unless conflict resolution has been tried. In Iraq, conflict resolution was never tried. Jerry Bremer and his successors went into Iraq and told the Iraqis, listen, here's the kind of state you're going to have. Here's the kind of church-state relations you're going to have. Here's how you should divide your oil revenues. Here's how you should regulate your relations with outside power. Never asked the Iraqis how they wanted to do it. Never brought them into contact with facilitators who might have helped them make their own decisions. So the war is unjust. And most of the wars that we've been involved in, at least since World War II, in my view, are unjust. What can we do about it? That's something for us to talk about after I sit down, stand up, whatever, stop this talk. But one thing I tell you, I quote a little bit from the book. We're in a kind of strange situation in America today where I don't know if I'm kind of preaching to the converted or the unconverted. That is to say, as I mentioned earlier, all polls show that if I say the Afghan war is not worth fighting, was not worth fighting to begin with, if I say it's not really about controlling Al-Qaeda, which has left town, anyway, it's about other things, about geopolitical influence, about minerals under the soil, about an air base in Bagram on the Chinese border, all sorts of other things. A lot of people will nod and will not say, oh, what a crazy anti-war guy this is. They'll nod and say, yeah, that's right, we don't think it should be fought either. Like 62%, the latest poll, of people believe that the Afghan war is not worth fighting. But they're not out in the streets either. They're not even threatening to vote against Obama or the Democrats if they don't stop supporting the war. So, what's going on? Well, one theory is, and I just mentioned this quickly and I will then get off stage. One theory is that by fighting wars with a volunteer army at a great distance from the United States, by trying to limit civilian casualties and so-called collateral damage abroad, even though everybody knows you can't really limit it, I mean, you can limit it somewhat. By keeping the war on the back pages of the newspapers, etc., you get a kind of, consent is too strong a word, a kind of toleration of the continued warfare. People are discontented, but it's a kind of passive discontent. And some people say that the key to the passive discontent is minimizing American casualties. That the difference between this war and previous wars like Vietnam, where there was a substantial anti-war movement, is not just that there's no draft, because there have been other movements in which there was no draft, that there were serious anti-war movements, but rather that the casualty rate is relatively low. So, I want to finish by talking about two answers to this argument, that we can continue to accept what essentially what most people believe is an unjust war because casualty rates are so low. Now I'll read to you, if you don't mind. First, U.S. experience since the Persian Gulf War of 1990-91 shows a significant decrease in American deaths produced by the use of high-technology offensive weaponry and improved defensive measures. Body armor, for example, and 32,000 wounded. The second answer is that even if the number of U.S. casualties could be lowered to 0, that would not secure our consent to the slaughter of foreigners in unjust wars. At least 100,000 civilians died in the Iraq War, with some estimates running as high as 500,000. Those who believe that we would easily sacrifice other people's lives in exchange for a guarantee of our own armed forces' safety don't have a very high opinion of Americans' moral character. The major premise of this book, which I want to close by reaffirming, is that we will not kill and die without being convinced that the struggle is justified on grounds of legitimate self-defense or moral duty. The current war system, with its pattern of continuous interventions in an ever-expanding zone of conflict, seems designed, consciously or unconsciously, to wean us from the habit of demanding justifications for specific wars. It's an act of faith, perhaps, to assert that this will not work, that Americans will remain unwilling to fight except for a cause they are convinced is just. Nevertheless, I will keep that faith, and I invite you to keep it as well. Thanks.